Good morning. Welcome to the Point. For the past few weeks, we've been talking to your lawmakers in Lansing to find out what's on their agenda for this fall session. We know that auto no-fault insurance reform is a big agenda item, but we don't know if they'll be able to come to any type of consensus. This week, we talked to one member of the House, a Republican, one member of the Senate, a Democrat, to find out what their individual priorities are, starting with Senator Curtis Hertel. He's a Democrat from East Lansing. Senator, among all the talk of no-fault auto insurance reform and some of the other things that may be taking place this fall, I know you're working on a couple of initiatives that you're particularly interested in. Tell me what YES means.
YES means yes is an incredibly important bill to me. You know, we have a epidemic of sexual assault on our college campuses. You know, when you send your daughter to school, you should have to worry about how much her books are or what their grades are going to be. But unfortunately, we have to worry about their safety. And the numbers that have come out are that 1 in 4 women on our college campuses are being sexually assaulted. And I think it's a cultural problem. I think we haven't done enough to teach basic respect for people's partners, basic respect for others' bodies. And we're competing with the internet and movies and all those other things. And I think one of the ways we can change our culture is by teaching in our other schools, in our elementary schools, not just respect in our elementary schools, but in our sex ed classes when we get to high school, talking about affirmative consent, which basically means you don't have a right to take someone else's body or use their body without them giving you permission. And I think it's a pretty basic issue. You know, I look at my own daughter, and her entire life, she'll be taught, you know, where not to walk, and what not to wear, and how to keep her drink safe, and to carry keys, and to carry mace or pepper spray. And my sons will never be taught about having basic respect and not being perpetrators. Now I'm going to teach them that, and my wife and I are going to teach them that. But when you have this kind of epidemic of sexual assault and the way that it affects a person for the rest of their life, we have to do something. And so I think this is a bipartisan issue. We worked with the First Lady's office. We worked with the domestic violence coalitions to really come up with a bill that will try to change the culture here in Michigan. And I think it's very important to me.
You feel confident about getting this done?
I feel passionate about getting it done. Obviously, anytime we're talking about sexual education, there can be pitfalls in the legislature. There are some people that would prefer we just never talk about it. What I would say back to those people is that we're not trying to encourage anyone to have sex. In fact, what we're trying to do is to prevent unwanted sex. And that should not be a partisan issue. None of us want there to be women that are sexually assaulted. Nobody wants that. So for me, I think those of us, if they take a long look at this issue, they'll see what's happening on our college campuses is unacceptable and that we have to do something about it. And is this going to solve every problem? No. But I think it's a good step into changing our culture and getting it done.
One of the other things that you have worked on, and I think that we've seen this effort on the federal level, trying to get people to spend money, tax money, to spend it with companies within the United States. You'd like to see something like that in Michigan?
Absolutely. You know, there are states that even surround us that have protections of their own companies, so that when state jobs, state contracts are being bid out, that they're more likely to go to employers in that state, so that Michigan people would actually be benefiting from our tax dollars being spent. Unfortunately, that's not the case now in Michigan. We have something on the books that makes a suggestion that they choose Michigan companies, but quite frankly, it's not happening. In fact, Treasury told us in committee that it's rarely, if ever, used. And what we want to do is put an 8% incentive to hire Michigan-based companies. You know, you look at something like Pure Michigan. Now, Pure Michigan is what could be more Michigan than Pure Michigan, right? Well, I think people would be surprised to know that the magazine is printed by an out-of-state company, that the website is maintained by an out-of-state company. Why would we want those kind of jobs being done by anybody else than a Michigander? And for me, when we're investing our tax dollars, when we're making sure that it's responsible, we want to make sure that the taxpayer isn't overpaying. But at the same time, I want to make sure that's investing in Michigan jobs, because those jobs go and pay taxes and shop places in Michigan and create more benefits for our economy as well. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And I think it's a common sense perspective. Earlier this year, the Senate bipartisanly passed something like this for the Detroit salt mines against a Canadian firm. So we already know that it can be done. But if it's good enough for the Detroit salt mines, it should be good enough for every company in Michigan. We want to create good Michigan jobs, and taxpayer dollars should be spent to do that.
When you talk about particularly MEDC, and when you talk about the magazine, when you talk about the website, have you had the opportunity to ask them why that they use out-of-state?
They use the lowest bidder. You know, I mean, the out-of-state companies bid, and they were the cheapest price. But it's not like we don't have Michigan companies that could have done that work. And I just think we want to invest in the Michigan worker. I mean, when Michigan taxpayers' dollars are spent, why not use it to create Michigan jobs? And it's not just other states. There are examples of Canadian companies and even farther overseas companies that Michigan is still using when there are good Michigan producers of those same products. And so, for me, we want to create great Michigan jobs here, but sometimes you got to put your money where your mouth is, and the state isn't doing that right now.
Talk to me a little bit about, I think, what has been called a healthcare bill of rights. It is a group of tenets that you and many of your Democratic colleagues have been talking about all summer, and it's something that comes into particular focus because in Washington, the ever-changing face of healthcare changed again this week with an executive order.
Yeah.
So tell me what that would look like if you and your colleagues were to prevail.
We had a health care town hall with Winnie Brinks in Grand Rapids, and we heard from people that are really scared. They have pre-existing conditions. They're older, and they're buying insurance on the exchange. And the only reason they can afford insurance is because of the protections that are in the Affordable Care Act. And when they hear repeal and replace or any of those things, getting rid of those protections will make it much harder for a senior to buy a policy or someone with a pre-existing condition to buy a policy. And we want to make sure we're protecting those protections, that regardless of what they do with Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. has never been great at protecting citizens anyways. So we need a Michigan solution. And so we want to put some of those same protections, making sure that if you're a senior, you can still be able to afford insurance, making sure that if you have a pre-existing condition, just because your child has had cancer and recovered doesn't mean that you should never be able to buy insurance again. And that's what we saw before the Affordable Care Act. For all its flaws, and I'm not saying we shouldn't fix parts of it, we certainly should. But for all its flaws, we have more people covered in this country than we ever did in our history. People aren't going bankrupt because of these conditions. And on top of that, they're able to find insurance, and you should be able to find insurance. And I think that's something that Michigan could do to say, listen, Washington, D.C., we don't care what you're going to do. At the end of the day, we're going to lay some ground rules here for the people of Michigan. And one thing we're not going to put up with is for our seniors or for those that have had diseases in the past to not be able to get insurance. It's just not fair.
Can a state impose those kind of rules and then only allow those companies that would ensure that meet that specification to come in the state?
We control our insurance market. So unlike a lot of things where you have interstate commerce clause in the Constitution you worry about, we have an insurance commissioner. We're able to impose specific rules on Michigan insurance companies. So there always are federal ERISA rules. It doesn't mean that so if someone buys from a federal ERISA plan, if you're a certain size company, that could change. But if you're looking at individual insurance rates for individual self-plans, absolutely, we can make those rules.
Speaking of insurance, let's talk about a subject that I may have done more stories on as an individual subject than any other, maybe the budget during the early 2000s, but that's auto no-fault insurance.
Yeah.
When I walked into that building over there 20 plus years ago, they were talking about reforming it. They're still talking about reforming it.
Sure.
And so far, there have been changes, but not the kind of significant changes that some people are talking about. Give me your take on what we ought to be doing with auto no-fault, if anything.
Yeah. I think the mayor's made some good points, so I don't want to criticize the mayor because I think he's got a real problem in the city. And the problem is that we have the highest insurance rates in the country. And specifically in Detroit, the highest of any city in the country. And that's a huge problem, and we need to solve it. It's a barrier to employment, and I agree with him. I think that the problem is that when you look at the problem, you have to look at it and try to solve it for the people and not the insurance companies. And so far, what I've seen mostly does a lot for the insurance companies and very little for people. I think they've made some good points. I think that for example, the idea that a senior has to carry Medicare and also car insurance of unlimited care probably doesn't make sense because they already have unlimited care. So there are things that we can do that they've suggested, and I think it's a good idea. But you can't actually attack the insurance rates without actually at least looking at some of the practices of the insurance companies. Like, for example, credit scoring. Now, I don't know what someone missing a bill 10 years ago has to do with their driving record, but right now, insurance companies can jack up your rates because of a problem on your credit report. Not driving related, nothing to do with your car. That to me doesn't make any sense. The extreme redlining. If you live in one side of a line, all of a sudden you pay double of somebody who lives in the opposite side of a line. I grew up in the city of Detroit, so I've seen the terrible rates that happen there, and that my neighbors that lived across the street over in Grosse Pointe paid a significantly less amount, even though we were basically living on the same street. To me, that needs to change. So while I do believe that the mayor has struck a chord to the right problem, I don't think we can do it just in favor of the insurance companies. We need to look at the entire problem, and they need some more consumer protections in their law as well.
The question of auto no-fault reform continues to be one that lawmakers will deal with in Lansing. As for some of the other priority items for the senator, that will depend on getting some bipartisan support. We'll continue to watch that as well. And we'll be back with more To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. So what's going on with your legislators in Lansing? Well, for one thing, we know they all have individual priorities. And when we sat down to talk to Kalamazoo County's Brant Iden, a Republican in the House, he talked about a very specific bill that he had introduced to make sure first responders know they're a priority in the state. Representative, a piece of legislation that you sponsored has passed committee. And it's particularly topical given some of the events recently where first responders are forced to go into a live fire situation. They're always in danger. They're always the first, thus first responders. Right. But in recent weeks, months, and years, we have really seen that danger, the potential for it, ratchet way up. Tell me what your bills, if they're finally approved, would do, how it could help protect those first responders, and the kind of penalties it would carry for anybody who would run afoul of this law.
Sure. So this puts first responders in a category where they're getting an added protections for being directly attacked. So if you're an individual that has the intent of attacking an officer, an EMS agent, firefighter, this bill could carry up to an additional 2-year sentence. And I'm working with Representative Yarrick and Representative Kesto on this bill package. As you mentioned, came out of committee, waiting to see what happens next with it, obviously, but gaining a lot of support for this because, as you mentioned, this is what we're seeing, unfortunately, across the country. These first responders are really being targeted. They're, in some cases, we heard stories in committee where, these individuals would set up perhaps a detonating type device to detonate after the crowds had already left the building, knowing full well that the first responders are going to come in with the intent to attack these people and do harm to them. And I believe the state of Michigan needs to show our first responders that we have your back.
When you think about all of the different scenarios that they have to work with, we in our newsroom very often will hear their staging, waiting for police.
Right.
So like if you get a call for EMS or ambulance, or sometimes they'll wait if there's a danger in the situation, which now slows down the response time. But it really puts a fine point on the fact that there is that potential danger. Some of it could be inadvertent, but what you're talking about is a deliberate attack on people. And we have seen this too, where some officers are called to what are really false calls for that very purpose.
That's right. We heard a story in committee that an officer responded to a domestic disturbance call and was rapping on the door, police, etc., notifying the person inside who they were, and another person from upstairs came down and assaulted the officer with an intent to do harm just because they heard there was an officer in the building. And it's sort of these attacks, but this is just one of many, unfortunately, that it upsets me so much. And it was very impassioned testimony. We heard that these officers who risk their lives for us every day are being targeted by individuals. I mean, we already know that we're struggling to get people into these jobs to begin with, but how do you feel if you're a parent and your son or daughter's talking about going into law enforcement or firefighting or whatever it happens to be, and you're turning on the news and you see these attacks? You can't get people that are going to want to do this. And why would they? Because they're being systematically targeted. And I believe this legislation, and let me be clear, an additional 2 years, I understand that. That's not, I've had a lot of people who said, Brand, it needs to be tougher, and I get that. Maybe this just gets the person off the street for another 2 years, but really what this does is show these first responders that this legislative body, this governor, we support you in what you're doing. We realize that you're putting your lives on the line every day for us, and the least we can do is have your back here in Lansing.
And we should point out that would be in addition to whatever criminal penalties would be attached to whatever crime that they may have committed. So
that's correct.
It isn't as if it isn't already punishable. This is just to say these people, because of their unique circumstance, have an extra protection.
That's right. It could get up to an additional 2 years on whatever sentence that they happen to, for whatever crime.
Okay, that still would have to get through the House and over the Senate. We'll follow up on that. Here's something that also would have to go through all of those hurdles, but it doesn't have the advantage, at least as we sit here, of having passed committee. And many suspect, including this reporter, that in its current form is not going to be its final form, but it's auto no-fault insurance. Now,
sure.
I have talked to hundreds of members over 2 decades about this, and it always comes down to the same question. Everybody's like, we got to do something, but just not that.
Right.
And there are never 56 and 19 and 1. So here we are again. Recently there was a very long hearing, and they talked for hours about this bill that would mandate price rollbacks, give some choice so you wouldn't necessarily have to have the unlimited catastrophic care. Tell me a little bit about your thought about the bill, because
sure.
As it is now, it's really in the committee, but it's really in the talking stages.
It is, and it's funny. I'm going to add myself to that list of members you just mentioned. We absolutely have to do something, right? I mean, we know that we pay some of the highest auto insurance rates in the country, and in some cases, the highest amount. And it is because of our very unique system in the state of Michigan, and that's well known and recognized, and we understand that. And it really is, no matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat, when I knock on your door in my district, just about the number one thing I hear about is, Brant, I'm paying too much for auto insurance. And I agree with that. I mean, I pay a lot, we all pay a lot. And so we here have tried to prioritize that and say, okay, we need to do something about it. This latest iteration of that. The last time this was done was 2 years ago, my first year in the House, and we tried to kind of take another run at this. I think the bill has gotten better since then, but there are still some challenges with it. We've just seen that there are going to be some added costs incurred. This came out just today. The House Fiscal reported the strain that this might put on the state budget, as well as a number of other concerns that have kind of come forth as we look at this legislation and say, okay, is this the right thing?
So the question becomes then, if you got to do something,
yep.
right? What is it? And again, it's that magical 56 vote formula. I mean, really, the House is probably the linchpin on that, because the Senate's already passed what they could, a version of some changes
sure.
In the no-fault law. But one of the real questions is, do you, and this bill asks the question, or perhaps suggests an answer, do you have people, do you give them the option of opting in for something less than that unique in the nation lifetime benefit for catastrophic injury when nobody else in 49 states has that? Do you give them that option? And is that something that's palatable to you as you think about people out there who might opt for the lowest option and still only accrue a 20% and likely less reduction in their overall cost.
Well, what we have to look at is how would, if someone, by virtue of someone selecting that option, how do those costs play out for us anyway? Because you have an individual who is, by nature, by human nature, we look at the price list and we're going to choose the cheapest option, right? That's for most individuals, that's sometimes just the case, and they're going to look at it and say, okay, this option's cheaper, I'm going to go with this option, and then they get involved in a catastrophic accident. What kind of pressures does that put on the system, and what kind of pressures does that put on us as taxpayers? I think it's incumbent upon the legislature to find a balance there, and I don't know that we're there yet. Like you say, this bill has got some tweaking to do. Things can definitely change at any point in time with things and amendments in the process of the bill. But we have to say there has to be a balance. We have to make sure that we're still protecting those that need that protection and are currently in the system, and still bring down costs. And I understand that there are always debatable ways to do that, but some of the ways that we've looked at, we know that we believe we can bring some of those costs down.
There is always the question that I hesitate to ask, because we try to deal with the possible. In other words, these are the things that might happen, and no-fault insurance reform might happen. The question I've always asked is, why no-fault insurance? It was a 1970s era experiment that many people jettisoned long ago, and there's still a handful of states that have no fault, but nobody that has it the way we do. The majority of other states use a completely different way of doing that. You insure your property, I insure my property, and if the two of us come together, there will be an adjudication of which one of us or our insurance companies pay for it. We don't do it that way. Is no-fault a better way?
Well, no fault's one of the ways, and I will say this, one of the things that I admire about the system, and I know my colleagues do as well, is that we have seen cases of where these people have had traumatic head injuries and they've gone back to work. You know, we are one of the very few states where these people just don't, these individuals who get in these accidents don't just end up basically in the federal government system under Medicaid or Medicare. They actually are back into the workforce. They've been, and you talk to these family members who have had other family members that have been involved in these accidents, and they say, look, my son or my daughter, my husband, my wife, they're back working, they're back contributing as a member of society and a member of Michigan society and taxpayer as Michigan, in Michigan. And so those are very compelling stories, and ones that we always weigh, of course, against the costs of the program as well. We definitely need reform. We absolutely need cost reform, and we need to make sure that we balance that, though, with understanding that we also get people back to work.
We've just got a few seconds left, and you're not a gambling person, but let me ask you to put a percentage chance on something significant getting done with auto no-fault during this fall session.
Well, I'm optimistic. I believe that the parties can come together, and I think that we can get something done, because it's going to be a priority for not only the members of the House Republican Caucus, but the governor as well, and the Senate Republican Caucus, to ensure that we get something done and that we save money for the taxpayers.
So for now, the question about auto no-fault remains. It will be the biggest single item the legislature will deal with this fall, if in fact they deal with it at all. Can they come to a consensus? They've tried for decades. We'll continue to watch, and we'll have more to the point. So in Lansing, they're trying to decide what they'll do in this fall term, but there are some members, and some who aren't, who have already decided what they'll do. They're going to run for office. We'll talk to two people seeking another office right here next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. You join us. To the Point.